India was likely to be one of the beneficiaries of a US move away from China. This fact was also visible in the global growth projections, where India would have lost just 0.3 percentage point growth in FY26 compared with 0.8 percentage points that the world was expected to experience. Welcome to Beyond Averages, our weekly data podcast which breaks down the number behind the top stories. But with trade relations somewhat normalizing between the US and China and countries looking to ink a deal, what implications can it have for India? The leaders of both the countries met in Geneva to discuss on trade, and both have stepped down from the high tariffs imposed since. Both countries had imposed over 100% tariffs on each other. Since then, tariffs have reduced. Although China does not get a 10% bracket that the world is experiencing, it still has 30% tariffs on it. Will a better global growth now lift the Indian economy, or will we see India lose its advantage with US and China closer to a deal? Moreover, with Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal in the US trying to reach an interim agreement, will India be able to get a more favorable deal than China? We have with us Vijay Chauhan, Executive Director, Deloitte, and Manoranjan Sharma, Chief Economist, Infomerics Ratings, to discuss the issue. Thanks for coming on the show, both of you. But before we move on to what is happening, let me explain to you what's boiled down till now from January till April. If you look at it, the IMF was projecting global growth to be 3.2% in 2025. This figure has now changed to 2.4% in its April forecast. US growth has come down from 2.4% to 1.5%. So for IMF, if I look at it, for the global growth, it's a minus 0.8% change. For US, minus 0.9%. Euro area is minus 0.5%. UK is minus 0.1%. China is minus 1.3, which is the highest magnitude here, and India was just minus 0.3, largely protected from all this effect. If we move forward as to how India has performed across, India would have been an exception from the world in terms of growth. Our growth would have only come down from 6.5% expected in FY25 to 6.2% as per IMF forecasts. But a reset now, with global growth starting to show up, with economists saying that US might escape in recession, might put India back on track if we consider IMF's January projection. Let us go to our experts. Manoranjan Sharmaji, first to you. What does a China-US trade deal mean for global growth outlook and India's growth prospects?
Two parts to this question. So I think globally it's good for the global economy. There have been significant reductions in the tariff rates by both countries. US has reduced to tariffs to 30% from 145% it had imposed on China, and China has agreed to reduce tariffs to a level of a modest level of say 10%, down from 125%. But a note of caution that these may or may not stay, because right now the announcement is that this is a pause for 90 days. So these are early days. We'll see how it goes. In case of India, there are some good aspects, there are some bad aspects, but then net, I think from India's point of view, the earlier situation was better for India because the China plus strategy. Lot of firms, industries, they were considering shifting from China, which was conventionally considered to be a factory of the world, to India. So that process might take a hit.
Mr. Chauhan, we were discussing earlier on how tariffs are now the buzzword here, when nobody talked about them about 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. What do you feel would this tariff changes have for global growth, the impact, and what would it entail for India, at least in the short term scenario?
For many years, the world had attempted to bring down the tariffs And it is generally believed that international trade, which is one of the engines of growth, not just for the world, but for India as well, uh, any disruption, so to say, at the borders, whether they are because of tariffs or non tariff issues, actually reduce the potency of this engine of growth that is export. So, the attempt by the largest economy in the world to kind of impose tariffs which are punitive and are distortionary in the sense that they are not uniform following the most favored nation principle, where the product attracts the same rate of duty whether it comes from a country A or B, except for some exceptions with like the bilateral trade agreement, or in case of some kind of an unfair trade which is for which the duties are imposed like anti-dumping or countervailing duty in case there are subsidies. So that regime was much better for international trade. However, the way the US has gone about using the tariff, and the tariff, the way it is being used, is almost like a silver bullet to solve many problems. We all know that it doesn't work like that. We are in the phase of a very high level of uncertainty, which is not something that the international trade likes. Adam Smith, more than 200 years ago, talked about canon of certainty when he was talking of taxes. It is equally important for international trade. And we need to keep understanding as to what's happening before we say what is going to be its impact on the world, on the international trade, and on different countries. But I was just listening to one of the interviews by the head of the Los Angeles and Long Beach port, and he said that the vessel arrival at the port from China is more than 30% down. So those are direct impacts on the reduction in export and import, and they will have the reflection in terms of the growth numbers that you brought about in your graph. It will be differential depending on how much each of the economy is linked to the global trade. A country like India, which is in some sense, not as linked to the international trade, would have much less impact. But all of us, would benefit from a trade regime which is more stable and transparent.
Mr. Chauhan, you talked about uncertainty. What does this do to businesses? Because you work with Deloitte, you would know better. The uncertainty part also hinders the Capex growth at times. The government survey was just out, which said that Capex outlook might be lower this year. What do you think it does for Capex, especially for companies looking to invest? Because this 90-day pause, I believe, doesn't help too much because you don't know. There's uncertainty there as well.
Perhaps, as a student of economics, as someone who was with the government for 30 years, now with Deloitte advising the industry, I think uncertainty is perhaps the worst thing insofar as the trade is concerned. They like the certainty, even if it is, a bit of an unpleasant nature. I always argue that this is what we need to bring about. My studies, etc., in the field of international trade also highlight that investments are something which is long term. So whenever there is an heightened uncertainty, the activities which are long term are the ones which are first put on pause. And investments are something which is long term for always. So therefore, even though the US administration is trying to bring some of the investments into the US, India would be keen to bring some investments into India as part of China Plus One policy. And all of them would be put on some kind of a, hold on for the time till there is a greater certainty regarding how the world is going to pan out, not just 1 year later, but maybe 3 or 5 years later.
Mr. Sharma, going to you, but before that, let me show you a few other graphs as well. Moving on, if we look at how India has been performing in the first months of tariffs, which is April when they kicked in, India's economic activity, manufacturing at least, did perform a slightly better. You compare it to the world and we were much better. India was at 58.2, Australia 51.7, and all these economies from US, China, Japan and all were in the contraction zone. 50 is the mark that separates expansion from contraction. So India was performing better, is performing better initially. Mr. Sharma, what can we do in this circumstance? One, domestic demand, of course, is going to prop up the economy. In terms of what we can do on the trade side, what do you think is the best option there?
And I think in the ultimate analysis, India is largely a domestically driven economy, unlike China, where exports and outward orientation constitutes a far more significant part of their economy. So here I would briefly refer to the push and pull factors. In the push factors, lower tariffs, de-risking diversification. Pull factors, ease of doing business, domestic market size. We have issues like PLIs have done very well in certain areas, production linked incentives, demographic dividend is still on and is likely to be on for another at least 15 years or so. Maybe these PLIs, Make in India, Make for India, all these could help Indian manufacturing sector to leverage the economies of scale and will do well both for the industrial sector and the Indian larger macroeconomy.
So one more question, sir. You were talking about the China plus one strategy and what happens to it now. What are your arguments on the China plus one now that US is inching closer to a deal on that stance? What do you do in that circumstance? Do we lose out, or should we go out and make more FTAs in order to just supplement China in other areas, if not with the US?
Losing out would be a strong sentence. I'll say we will take some kind of a negative impact, but then it has been increasingly realized all over the world that the concentration risk is very bad, either in the financial sector or in international relations. So countries, in any case, they were looking to diversify their supply chains, have a partnership with greater. So I think this process will continue, maybe not with the same momentum. India has again, like for example, recently signed a very significant trade deal with the United Kingdom. There are several other deals on with the European Union, with the OPEC countries and so many other Gulf countries. So all this will help to de-risk, reduce the element of concentration risk. So this process will continue across countries, across the development spectrum.
Mr. Chauhan, one of the things that goes missing when we are talking about tariffs and the differential levies that are put on by the US is the hidden aspects of trade, especially productivity and other aspects which also put India behind in certain scenarios. We have lost out, we were losing out on China plus one before the tariff war started as well. There was a report by the World Bank which said Vietnam had gained more. What can India do different this time around to gain in those areas at least? And do you concur with that hypothesis that we need to improve those parts as well?
You were putting words in my mouth, actually. The international trade is driven more by the fundamentals than by tariff. It's only an accident today that tariffs have kind of seemed to have acquired greater importance. And when we are talking the tariff between, let's say, India, if we simplified the world to be like, everybody trying to enter into the US market and China was one of the competitors. Let's say that we went back to 8th of April, for example, in terms of, where the world stood. There is no doubt that the differential has come down. But let's say that what the position today, if that was to be actualized, we would have 10% tariff on goods going from India to the US and 30% tariff on an average. So not on an average in terms of the modal rate of tariff would be about 30% for the US. Now that's 200% more tariff. The world plays today on margins which are far, far smaller than the difference of 10% and 30%. So insofar as China plus one strategy is there, and as was pointed out, the reasons for that in terms of, de-risking the supply chain essentially by avoiding the concentration, that would continue. India needs to be more agile in taking advantages which have come our way accidentally because of the tariffs. But our long-term comparative advantage will come not so much because of the tariffs, but because of other factors like bringing in efficiency in production, having a faster and more trade facilitative environment, we also have a significant enhancement and engagement as part of the global supply chain, because there are very few commodities that India would be exporting which do not require some degree of imports coming into the country. One of the largest export items that India has to the US is actually generic pharmaceuticals, and we all know that those generic pharmaceuticals have APIs which come from China. And in fact, it is good that the tariffs on China have come down for 30%. God forbid if they were higher, then if when we look at the rules of origin that the United States has, all of the formulations being exported from India would then have been classified as Chinese goods, and they would have attracted a much higher rate of duty than what we are talking about here. So quite often in tariffs, the devil lies in the detail, and it's very important to talk about them as well. And that's what we do sometimes when we have such very precise questions to answer.
Now, there is this, this question goes to both of you, and I'll ask Dr. Sharma first before I go coming to you, sir. There's this talk about Make in America now. America was always an IP producer. As I remember, there was that iPhone that was coming from America, the IP of it at least, and then it was getting produced in China. So now that Make in America, where they want to produce everything from a needle to a car kind of a scenario, what implications could this have for India's ambition? Because we are also running a Make in India program. Dr. Sharma, first to you.
So can you repeat your question?
So there is all this talk about the Make in America which is happening. What does it do? What implications could it have for Make in India? President Trump just recently said that I don't want iPhones to be made in India. So how do you balance out those imperatives as they go out?
Well, both countries are justified in their points of view. All countries historically have pushed ahead with what they call their national interest. So Trump is pushing for what they call MAGA, Make America Great Again. We are pushing for India. In 2-3 points, quick points. One is that in case of iPhone, maybe the finished product is about $1,000, but we are doing the lower end kind of work in Noida, in other places. So some rough anecdotal evidence suggests that maybe we are getting something like 40 to 50 US dollar per piece. We have to scale it up. And the issue is we must focus on the qualitative aspects. Recently, we had the 4-day war between India and Pakistan, and all our defense equipments came out with flying colors. So no wonder all our defense stocks have risen over the roof. So perhaps this is the way to grow. Instead of unduly bothering about what we should focus on quality, on moving up the value chain, on increasing the reliability, the timelines of your schedule. So over the long haul, this will put us in very good stead.
Mr. Chauhan, can Make in America and Make in India work in tandem, or is there a dichotomy there that exists?
I'm amused by this desire for good old days. Good old days don't really come back, and when you try and play with the market forces and take certain economic steps to kind of go back in time, if I were to use that expression, maybe that's not the most appropriate one. Getting manufacturing in the US is a very great thing. Nobody can argue if the people want the manufacturing to shift to US. It is the bounden duty of the democratic government to try and address that. However, given the wages which are there in the United States, it's not very easy for US to go and start manufacturing those products unless the American citizens are willing to pay that much higher price for the domestic products. Because there is no way that America can produce the same product and sell domestically without having a much higher price. That's what has been done and attempted in India. So when you put tariff walls, you can create a domestic market, but that domestic market, the domestic buyers will have to pay a much higher price. So that is what I think is likely to happen. There is one interesting bit of data which is floating around all over, that while the president tries to bring manufacturing back to the US, there are lots of manufacturing jobs for which there are no takers. The average daily wage in US is more than the monthly wage in India. And if you're
Yeah.
talking of, X number of products which are labor intensive, they would continue to be manufactured there. So some of these games which are happening, in terms of factors of production when we're looking at, so ignore for the time being the demand. It's like investment, as in finances, which move across the borders pretty easily. The two is material which go into production, and the third is the labor which goes in. Now, the labor is so differentially priced across the world that manufacturing has moved to answer that. Now, the world over, the countries are trying to get, because when you bring in the demand will arise only when there is employment which is generated there. So
Yeah.
some kind of a rebalancing is in order, and it's happening. But the way US is trying to bring back these manufacturing, it's not going to be very easy. Insofar as India is concerned, we've had some similar experiences in some of the sectors, as was pointed out by Dr. Sharma. We've had success. Apple is a case study in which can be studied. So we have a lot more jobs in Apple. But if we looked at the value addition of the entire, let's assume $1,000 of iPhone, we get less than it's about $30, right, in $1,000 price. But we do have more employment. So it's a national debate then to see whether you want a pie in the value addition, or you want a pie in the labor consumption, or you can have both. It's very difficult to have both, uh, but some kind of employment is always good, and I think US is trying to do that.
Let me put an analysis that we did a while ago regarding India and China and what India could take away from China in the original tariff situation if that was to exit. So India had a $37 billion opportunity with the April 2 tariffs thing. If you look at it, we compared price across per product and where India had an advantage, ignoring the aspects of labor productivity and all. And India could take away about $25 billion worth of trade from China, about $4 billion from Thailand, 971 million, which is mostly garments, from Bangladesh. From Vietnam, we could about 3.3 billion. So total was this. In terms of what percentage of trade we could sway from them, this was 7% and 12.3% for Bangladesh. Now, one of the points that is being talked about, and it's much consternation for the UK as well. I was reading this in a lot of articles and expert comments, that UK has moved faster for a deal with the US. But some of those aspects of the deals, because it moved too fast, might not be very favorable for the UK. So a fast deal with the US regime also doesn't work in the favor, while others are arguing that EU or China might get a better deal by standing their ground. Now, I won't ask you the question on how fast we should move, because that's not something you can answer, but what are some things that we should keep out of this deal for sure, which we should stand with or abide by as far as our production here is concerned? Dr. Sharma, first to you, then Mr. Chauhan.
Well, agriculture has to be kept out of this deal with US. There are certain other things that we have to be selective. Instead of spending money on, let's say, planes and other fighter jets, if we can get some kind of a competitive advantage, cost advantage, like for example, the drones is the new way to go. If we can get cheaper, cost effective drones, whether we make them in India or somewhere else, we can source them. So the deal will have to be selectively worked out. We have to focus on those items where, while reducing the trade deficit with the US, we also take full care of our domestic needs and requirements.
Mr. Chauhan, over to you on this question. As I understand, Dr. Sharma was talking about technology transfer as well needs to be kept in mind. What do you think we should keep in mind while dealing with the US? Because a lot of people are saying that if you give a lot to Mr. Trump, he would ask for more.
Perhaps the most, what should I say? It requires a kind of persistence and due diligence, and you have to be at it for a long period of time. India-UK deal was 3 years in the making. We still have announced a deal. The details of it are not known to us. When you look at the UK-US deal, you realize that it's hardly a deal. It's an announcement of a deal. So what's happening in some sense is that it's a real-time news world. So a lot of the political leaders are using this changed economic and the communication world to announce things which take a lot of time to be actually implemented. India signed an agreement, EFTA agreement, last year in April. Do we know that it actually still hasn't come into force? It hasn't, right? India has announced India UK agreement. We are some way away from implementing that because you see, earlier what used to happen in some sense was that the announcement was made only after all the I's had been dotted and the T's had been crossed. Now, for variety of reasons, the announcement are made sometime before that stage is actually reached. Uh, the media and the world and the people react to it, but the actual impact begins in some sense only after those agreements come into force. Therefore, the real benefits will come only if a trade agreement is negotiated fully, and the negotiations, and I have some experience of it, is actually goes product by product, HSN level. There are 10,000 more 8-digit entries in tariff code. So the negotiations have to be that, because quite often if you don't do that, it's like the title of your program, Beyond Averages. The average tariff might be 12% for India and 2% for the US, but the game is much beyond the averages, and it is important that the negotiators from India actually go beyond the averages to ensure that every interest of the country is protected and we get the best deal out of the agreement as and when it is signed. So I'm more focused on getting the best out of the deal rather than getting it fastest out of in the possible time.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. That's it for today. We are out of time. There was much more to discuss in terms of the green aspect of it. Thanks a lot. Will India be able to strike a deal fast, and would that deal be good is the question on everyone's mind. Our experts say it needs to be the best deal possible because a lot of modalities need to work out. There are already talks that the UK, which was the first one to move towards a deal, got the short end of the stick. Experts are pointing out that countries that are holding out seem to have done better than the ones that have given in to Trump's demand. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis. Thank you.